Ethan had always loved the open road. The hum of tires on asphalt, the endless horizon, the feeling of freedom as the miles stretched on before him. It was what he had always sought in life. So, when his friends invited him on a weekend road trip to a remote town they had all been hearing about, he didn't hesitate. It was the perfect escape from his routine, the perfect way to break free from the noise of everyday life. But he never imagined this trip would be anything but ordinary. It was just past dusk when they set off, the sun dipping behind the trees as they sped down the winding highway. The headlights cut through the thickening twilight, illuminating the lonely stretch of road ahead. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, the familiar rhythm of the car's engine lulling him into a relaxed state. His friend Max was driving, his fingers drumming on the wheel to the beat of the classic rock song blaring from the speakers. "Man, I'm so ready for this trip," Max said, glancing over at Ethan with a grin. "The road is ours. No distractions, no worries." Ethan chuckled and nodded. "Yeah, it's been too long since we all got away like this." Behind them, their friend Olivia was laughing along with the music, occasionally chiming in with a comment or a random story. It was the kind of trip that felt carefree, the kind of adventure that promised nothing but fun. But as the miles passed, the road began to feel wrong. Ethan couldn't put his finger on it at first, but there was something in the air, something in the way the scenery seemed to shift around them. The trees along the roadside grew taller, denser, as if the forest was closing in. The asphalt seemed to stretch endlessly, the occasional turn or curve offering no real change in the scenery. The world around them had become a blur of dark shadows and dim lights, and it felt as if they were driving through some kind of limbo. "Dude, how much longer until we reach this place?" Ethan asked, looking at the map on his phone. Max glanced over at him, his brow furrowing. "I don't know. It should have been just a few more miles. The GPS is acting weird." Ethan raised an eyebrow, noticing that the usual blue, indicating their location, was now just a static point on the screen. It didn't even show the road anymore. Olivia leaned forward from the back seat. "What's going on? Are we lost?" "Not lost," Max replied with a shrug. "Just off track. It happens. We'll be there soon." But as they kept driving, Ethan noticed something unsettling. The road never seemed to end. The landscape outside the windows remained the same: black trees, darkening skies, and empty stretches of highway. They passed the same old sign that read, "Welcome to Ashford," a town they hadn't even reached yet. They had passed it hours ago. How was that possible? Max's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he looked at the road ahead. "Okay, this is getting weird. What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with unease. Max didn't answer right away, his eyes glued to the endless stretch of asphalt before them. "I swear, I've driven this exact stretch before. We're going in circles." Olivia let out a nervous laugh, trying to break the tension. "Come on, guys, it's just a weird stretch of road. We'll figure it out." But the nervous edge in her voice made Ethan uneasy. The more he stared at the dark road ahead, the more he began to question if they were truly alone. There was something strange about the silence. No other cars, no sounds of wildlife, just the hum of their tires on the road and the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the world around them had gone completely still. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the road. Max cursed under his breath and tapped the dashboard. "Great, just great," he muttered. "What now?" Ethan looked out the window and then quickly turned his gaze back to the road ahead. There, just beyond the beams of their headlights, something was moving. It was quick, too quick to fully see, but it was unmistakable. A dark figure darting between the trees. "Did you guys see that?" Ethan asked, his heart skipping a beat. Max and Olivia looked at each other, then at the road. There was nothing now, only the endless blackness of the forest around them. "See what?" Olivia asked, her voice shaky. "I swear something was moving out there," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the edges of the road. "Maybe it was an animal or something." "I don't know," Max scoffed. "It's just your imagination, man." But as they drove on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Ethan could almost feel the eyes of something, or someone, on him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and every instinct told him to look out the window, to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. "I don't like this," Ethan said, his voice low. "We need to turn around. This doesn't feel right." But Max just kept driving, his expression tense. "We're fine, dude. We're just getting deeper into the woods. It's nothing." Yet, despite Max's reassurances, the sense of dread grew with every passing mile. The darkness outside seemed to press in on them, suffocating the car in its cold embrace. And still, the road stretched on, never ending, never changing. Just as Ethan was about to say something again, the car suddenly lurched forward, as if the road itself had jolted beneath them. The tires screeched, and Max swerved, barely managing to keep the vehicle under control. "What the hell was that?" Max shouted, his eyes wide with panic. "I don't know," Ethan said, heart pounding. "Did you feel that?" The headlights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow, stood in the middle of the road. Max slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. The car screeched to a halt, and silence fell. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. They were no longer on a road, at least it didn't feel like one anymore. The air was thicker now, charged with something unnatural. "We need to get out of here," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. But when Max tried to reverse the car, the engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. They were stuck. In the distance, the figure returned, standing in the road, watching them, unmoving, as if daring them to come closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The road wasn't just endless, it was a trap, and they had just driven straight into it. The figure stood there, tall and unmoving, like a twisted statue carved from the very shadows themselves. The air in the car had grown heavy, almost suffocating, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened to keep them trapped in this place. Ethan's heart raced, his fingers clutching the edge of his seat as he stared out the window, unable to tear his gaze away from the dark silhouette in the middle of the road. Max's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he turned the key again, but the engine sputtered, failing to start. "What the hell is happening?" Max's voice trembled, more anxious than Ethan had ever heard him before. Ethan glanced back at Olivia, whose face had drained of color. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't said anything since the figure had appeared, but Ethan could feel her terror growing, just like his own. "We're stuck," Olivia whispered, barely audible. "The car won't start, and I don't know what that thing is, but it's not human." Max shook his head, still trying to start the car. "It's just some crazy person out there. People like that show up all the time in the middle of nowhere." But Ethan knew that something was wrong. This wasn't just some stranger walking along the road. The way the figure stood, perfectly still as if waiting for something, it felt wrong. And the darkness surrounding them felt deeper now, like they weren't just on some rural highway anymore, but something much worse, something otherworldly. "Max, we need to get out of here," Ethan urged, his voice tight with panic. "We need to move right now." Max shot him a frustrated look. "The car isn't starting. What do you want me to do?" Ethan tried the door handle, desperate to get out. But when he reached for it, he realized something horrifying. The door was stuck. It wouldn't budge. "Damn it!" Ethan shouted, pulling harder, but the door didn't give. "We're trapped in here." A low, unnatural sound echoed through the air. A soft whisper, just loud enough for them to hear. It was coming from the figure in the road. "Do you hear that?" Olivia's voice shook with terror. It's talking." The figure had started to move. Slowly, with deliberate steps, it began crossing the road toward them, its long shadow stretching out before it like a dark omen. Ethan could make out only the faintest details of the figure, its limbs elongated, its head hanging low. The faintest of whispers seemed to echo from it, as if the trees themselves were speaking through the figure. "What the hell is that thing?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine as the whispers grew louder, no longer just in the air, but in his mind, crawling into his thoughts. He couldn't understand the words, but they felt like they were reaching into him, pulling at something deep within. He slammed his hands against the window. "Come on! Come on!" he shouted, his voice panicked, but the figure was getting closer, each step dragging it nearer to them, and the darkness around them seemed to grow heavier with every moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure stopped just outside their car. It stood there, staring at them with eyes that gleamed like black voids, empty and endless. Its long, thin fingers twitched, and the whispers began to sound like words now. Distorted, unintelligible, but unmistakable in their menace. "Max." Olivia's voice quivered. "What if we don't get out of here?" Max didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his eyes wide with terror, his body frozen in place. Ethan could see the fear in his friend's face, the realization that they were no longer in control of the situation. They weren't just lost in the woods anymore. They were trapped in something much darker. Suddenly, the air in the car grew colder, an unnatural chill that made Ethan's breath fog up in front of him. He shivered and looked at Max, who had stopped trying to start the car. His hands were trembling, his face pale. The figure outside the window raised one hand and slowly placed it on the glass, its fingers scraping against the surface with an eerie sound. Ethan jumped back, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure jerked its hand away, and the whispers stopped. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with fear. He looked out the window again, but the figure was gone. The road ahead was now shrouded in complete darkness. The trees seemed to lean toward the car, their branches like twisted fingers reaching for them. Ethan could feel the weight of the air pressing down on them, a suffocating heaviness that seemed to crush his chest. Max exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "We need to get out of here. We need to find help." But as he turned the key once again, there was no sound, no sputtering engine. The car was completely dead. Ethan's gaze flicked to the trees once more, where something moved in the darkness, shadows shifting in unnatural patterns. Then, through the thick blackness, he saw something else. Far ahead, just at the edge of the road, there was another figure. This one was smaller, but it was moving toward them with slow, deliberate steps. "Not again," Ethan muttered under his breath. "What the hell is going on?" Max looked out the window, then back at Ethan. "We have to go." But as they watched, the figure, just like the first, stopped. It stood motionless, staring at them from the distance. A strange sensation tugged at Ethan's chest, a pull he couldn't ignore. Something was calling to him from the darkness, something he couldn't resist. His fingers tightened around the door handle again, as if some invisible force was urging him to open it. "No," he whispered to himself. "Don't go." But it was already too late. The whispers began again. This time they were clearer. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, as if the forest itself was speaking. "Come closer," the voices whispered. "Come to us. The road is endless. There is no escape." Ethan's heart raced. He felt the cold weight of their words sink into his bones. "Max," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here. Now." Max nodded, but the fear in his eyes mirrored Ethan's own. He couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. The road wasn't just endless. It was alive, and it was pulling them deeper into its twisted web. Suddenly, the trees along the road shifted, their trunks cracking and groaning as if the very forest itself was alive. Some force was tugging at the car, at their minds, at their very souls. The world around them had turned into a nightmare, and they were its unwilling participants. And then, just as Ethan thought they were about to be swallowed by the darkness, the car jolted. The headlights flickered back on, and the engine sputtered to life. "Go!" Ethan screamed. "Drive now!" Max slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the car shot forward, but the road before them twisted, winding into a path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the abyss. The darkness was closing in again, and behind them the whispers grew louder. The car sped through the eerie silence, the engine roaring in protest as Max pushed the accelerator harder. The headlights sliced through the thick fog that now blanketed the road, but no matter how fast they drove, the darkness ahead seemed to grow ever deeper, consuming the path like a ravenous beast. Max's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and his eyes darted nervously between the rearview mirror and the endless stretch of road ahead. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his body tense, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. His hands were cold, and his heart thudded in his chest, as if something was trying to break free from within him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure, the shadow from earlier following them. But nothing. No trace of the thing that had haunted them. Yet still, the sense of being watched never left. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its eyes invisible but ever present, tracking their every movement. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't respond immediately. His grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw set in grim determination. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, he spoke. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not normal." Olivia, who had been silent for the past few minutes, suddenly spoke up. "We've been driving for what feels like hours. Why does the road never change? Why is it always the same?" Ethan glanced out the window at the thick trees that seemed to grow even taller as they drove, their gnarled branches twisting upward like grotesque hands. The forest appeared to stretch endlessly, as though the road itself was trapped within a never-ending loop. "I don't know," he said, "but it's like we're in a dream, or maybe something worse." Max's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror again, a look of concern crossing his face. "I'm telling you, we need to stop and figure this out. Maybe we can hike out of here and find help." Ethan didn't want to admit it, but something told him that would only make things worse. The idea of leaving the safety of the car terrified him more than anything. He had no idea what was out there, or what might follow them if they dared leave the vehicle. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to suggest they keep driving, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement, just ahead in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the headlights, but as they drew closer, he saw it clearly. A figure, human in shape, was standing in the middle of the road. "Stop! Max, stop!" Ethan shouted, gripping the dashboard. Max's foot slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding slightly on the damp road. The figure ahead remained motionless, standing in the middle of the lane, staring at them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could see the figure more clearly now, tall, thin, and wearing a long, dark cloak. The figure's head was bowed, as if lost in thought, its face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But it was the figure's stillness that chilled Ethan to the bone. It was as though it wasn't even alive, just a hollow shell waiting to be discovered. "Is it real?" Olivia whispered from the back seat, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ethan said, his eyes locked on the figure. "But we should be careful. We don't know what it wants." Max was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between the figure and the road. "I don't like this. I don't like this at all." "Don't get out of the car," Ethan warned, his voice urgent. "We don't know if it's dangerous." Max nodded reluctantly, but his face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. The car sat still in the middle of the road, the only sound the faint hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the trees bending in the wind. The figure remained unmoving. A long, suffocating silence filled the car. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, suffocating him in a way that made it hard to breathe. His eyes were glued to the figure in front of them, and his heart pounded with an inexplicable fear. Then, without warning, the figure lifted its head. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The face, if it could even be called that, was a blank mask of pale skin. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits, like two black voids that sucked the light from the air around them. No pupils, no expression, just an empty, endless gaze. "Max, what do we do?" Olivia's voice was high-pitched now, laced with panic. She reached for the door handle, but Ethan grabbed her wrist, stopping her. "Don't open the door. Just stay quiet." The figure's lips parted slowly, a low, raspy sound escaping its throat, like the creaking of old wood. "Turn back," it rasped. "This road will not lead you to safety." Max swallowed hard, his eyes flickering toward the rearview mirror once again. The road behind them was still just as empty as it had been moments before. No sign of anyone else, no movement. "Turn back," the figure repeated, its voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Max's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "We need to go. We need to go now." But as Max went to put the car in reverse, something unexpected happened. The figure took a step toward them. It was slow, deliberate, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky, as though it wasn't fully in control of its own body. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell?" Ethan gasped. Max slammed the gearshift into drive, and with a jolt, the car lurched forward, speeding past the figure. But as they drove, the trees seemed to close in around them. The darkness on the sides of the road grew even thicker, as if the very air had become dense, smothering. "We're not getting out of here," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling. "Don't say that," Olivia whispered, but her words lacked conviction. They drove faster, but the road remained the same, endless, winding, as though the world itself had become a labyrinth. The figure didn't vanish. It didn't fade away. It stayed, lingering in the darkness behind them, just out of sight. Max glanced at Ethan. "Do you think it was warning us?" "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice tight, "but I don't trust it." There was a moment of silence, and then Ethan heard it. Faint rustling. Not from the trees this time, but from inside the car. Ethan turned toward Olivia, her wide eyes locked with his, full of fear. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Olivia pointed to the back window. "Look." Slowly, Ethan turned his gaze toward the rearview mirror. The figure, the thing, was no longer in front of them. It was standing just behind the car, as though it had materialized out of nowhere. And it was getting closer. The whispers started again. The air inside the car had thickened, the tension so palpable it seemed to press against their skin. Max's hands were trembling on the steering wheel as he slammed his foot down on the accelerator, the car surging forward in a desperate attempt to escape the figure that was now trailing them. The headlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows on the road, and the darkness seemed to stretch even further, swallowing the light with a hunger that felt all too real. Ethan's breath was shallow, his chest tight with fear as he glanced nervously over his shoulder. The figure, the thing, was still there, walking slowly behind them, its movements unnatural, jerky, as if its body didn't belong in this world. The dark figure loomed, its face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, its eyes two empty voids that seemed to draw in the light, leaving nothing but shadows in their wake. "Why isn't it going away?" Olivia's voice broke the silence, her words barely a whisper. She was huddled in the back seat, her face pale with fear. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice tight, "but I don't think it's going to stop following us. Whatever it is, it's not human." Max's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I've never seen anything like this before. This road, the fog, that figure. It's all wrong." Ethan tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the road ahead, but no matter how fast they drove, the same dense fog pressed in on all sides. The trees to their left and right seemed to grow closer with every passing second, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, clawing at the car. The whispers started again. It was a faint sound at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine, but it grew louder with each passing moment. Soft, indecipherable words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan looked out of the window, his heart racing. The trees, were they moving? The wind howled outside, but it was more than just the sound of the breeze. It was the whispers, carried on the wind, filling the car with a presence that felt almost tangible. Max's foot pressed harder on the gas, but the road ahead remained just as endless as it had been for what felt like hours, the landscape unchanged. "Max, we can't keep driving like this," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "It's like we're stuck in a nightmare." "I know," Max muttered, his eyes wild with panic. "But if we stop, I don't know what will happen." Ethan's eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, the figure still there. It was still there, and now it was closer. The space between the car and the shadowy figure had closed dramatically in the last few moments. "Max, go faster," Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. "It's getting closer." Max obeyed without hesitation, pressing the accelerator even harder. The car surged forward, the engine growling in protest as it sped down the road. But no matter how fast they went, the figure continued to close in. It moved unnaturally fast, its long skeletal limbs stretching out like a predator in pursuit of its prey. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind shook the car, rattling the windows, and the entire vehicle swerved dangerously to the side. Max's heart lurched as the tires screeched against the pavement, the car nearly losing control. "Hold on," Max shouted, his voice strained with fear. Ethan felt the car tilt to one side, the world outside spinning, and for a brief moment he thought they were going to crash. But just as quickly as it had started, the wind stopped, and the car settled back onto the road. "What the hell was that?" Ethan gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. Max didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, his face a mask of terror. Ethan followed his gaze and felt a chill run down his spine. The figure, the thing, was now standing directly behind them, just a few feet away. It was no longer walking. It was standing completely still, its black cloak billowing in the wind, its face still hidden beneath the brim of the hat. And then the whispers grew louder. Max's grip on the wheel tightened, his face pale. "We need to get off this road. We need to find a way out. There's no way off this road." Ethan said, his voice shaking. "It's like we're trapped. We've been driving for hours and it's just endless." Olivia's breathing was shallow as she leaned forward, her eyes wide with terror. "It's like the road wants us to stay. Like we're not supposed to leave." Ethan shuddered. "That's exactly it. We're not supposed to leave. And whatever that thing is, it's making sure we don't." Max didn't say anything. He just kept driving, the car speeding down the road, the fog thickening around them, and the trees closing in tighter, their twisted branches clawing at the air like malevolent spirits. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of the whispers. It was suffocating, the stillness pressing in on them from all sides. The fog outside had thickened to the point where the headlights could barely cut through it anymore, and Ethan could no longer see the road ahead. It was as if the darkness had consumed the world, leaving them stranded in a void of nothingness. Max's voice trembled as he spoke. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but he was interrupted by a loud bang, a deafening sound that echoed through the car, making them all jump. Came from the back of the car. "What was that?" Olivia gasped. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked back through the rearview mirror. The figure was no longer standing behind them. It was inside the car. Max slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't slow down. The figure, now fully inside, was standing just behind Ethan, its cold, empty eyes locked onto his. Its hand reached out toward him, fingers long and unnaturally thin. Ethan froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, the figure whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "You can't escape." The figure's cold, clammy hand hovered just inches from Ethan's face. His breath caught in his throat, his body stiff as he tried to move but found himself frozen in place. The car had come to a screeching halt, but the thing behind him didn't stop. It was still there, its presence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake off. Max was paralyzed, his eyes wide with terror, and Olivia was gripping the back seat so tightly her knuckles were white. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Ethan's heartbeat pounding in his ears, louder and faster with every second. The figure stood there, its face still obscured by the brim of its hat, its body towering over Ethan, blocking out the last flicker of light from the headlights. The air around them felt thick, unnatural, as if the very atmosphere was alive and suffocating them. "You can't escape," the figure repeated, its voice low, guttural, and full of a chilling finality that made Ethan's blood run cold. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. The thing's hand inched closer, its long fingers stretched out like skeletal claws. Ethan's chest tightened, his pulse racing. He couldn't breathe. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. His eyes darted to Max, hoping for a sign, but Max remained frozen behind the wheel, his eyes locked on the mirror. "Max!" Olivia screamed, her voice frantic. "Do something!" Max's hands were shaking. He couldn't seem to take his eyes off the thing that was standing so close to Ethan. He could feel it too, the malevolent presence, the oppressive weight of something ancient and wrong. The air seemed to grow colder with every passing second, the car becoming a coffin they couldn't escape. "We need to move," Ethan finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Now!" Max blinked as if snapping out of a trance. His foot slammed on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, but it didn't feel like it was moving. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging, the fog thicker than ever. The figure, the thing, didn't disappear. It remained inside the car, standing just behind Ethan, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. The trees outside loomed closer, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, their silhouettes barely visible through the dense fog. The road was narrow, winding, and devoid of any landmarks, as though they had been swallowed up by some otherworldly realm where time had no meaning. "How is this happening?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's eyes were wide, searching the dark woods around them. "It's not real. It's got to be a hallucination. We're trapped in some kind of dream or nightmare." Max's hands gripped the wheel tighter. His knuckles were white, his knuckles sore from the pressure. "Whatever it is, we need to get out of here. We can't keep driving forever." But the road didn't seem to end. It just went on, an endless loop of darkness and fog. They could no longer see the trees. The car's headlights barely penetrated the inky blackness, leaving them with nothing but the strange, oppressive atmosphere that hung in the air. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The voices came from nowhere and everywhere, like 1,000 lost souls whispering in unison. "Turn back. Don't trust the road. You're already lost. Never leave." The words twisted and curled around Ethan's mind, creeping under his skin, digging into his thoughts. It was as if the road itself was alive, and the voices were part of its twisted consciousness, guiding them deeper into whatever dark fate awaited. Max slammed his fist onto the wheel in frustration. "I'm not listening to this. We need to get out of here now." But even as he spoke, the road ahead seemed to warp and stretch out even further. The headlights barely illuminated the fog, and the trees, if they were trees, appeared to shift and bend, their shapes no longer following any natural pattern. The landscape was changing. It was as though the world around them was rearranging itself. "This isn't right," Olivia whispered, her voice shaking. "None of this feels real. It's like we're trapped in a place that doesn't exist." Ethan's heart raced as the car began to slow, the engine sputtering as if it was losing power. The whispers, louder now, seemed to intensify, swirling around them like a storm. "Max!" Ethan shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "What's happening? Why is the car slowing down?" Max tried to press harder on the accelerator, but it was no use. The engine coughed and spluttered, the car crawling at a sluggish pace. The road ahead seemed to narrow, the trees now closing in around them, their branches bending low, as if trying to trap them in the confines of their twisted forest. The figure behind Ethan didn't move. It was still there, looming, its presence suffocating, watching, waiting. "I can't stop it," Max muttered, his voice breaking. "It's like the car. It won't move. It's as if something's holding us here." Olivia's eyes darted around the car, her gaze flicking from the rearview mirror to the dark expanse outside the windows. "We have to get out. We have to run. We can't stay here." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked out of the window. Something moved in the shadows outside, something large and shifting, its form undetectable in the thick fog. And then, a soft tapping sound. It was faint, at first, like the sound of fingers lightly drumming on the window. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. He turned to look, but the figure in the back seat was still standing there. The tapping came again, louder this time and closer. Tap, tap, tap. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, followed by a sharp, agonizing scream from outside. The sound of someone, being torn apart, as if the very air itself was splitting open. Ethan jerked back in his seat, his heart racing. What the hell was that? Max looked out of the window, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't speak. Ethan turned to the rearview mirror, his throat tight with fear. The figure was gone, but something worse had taken its place. Out of the thick, swirling fog, something massive was emerging, its form half hidden by the mist, its shape barely discernible. And it was coming straight toward them. Ethan's mind screamed at him to drive, to flee, but the car wouldn't move. And then the tapping came again, this time from inside the car. "Max, drive. Now!" Ethan screamed, but it was too late. The car jerked violently, as if something had seized it from the outside, its engine roaring to life in an instant. Max's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, his foot pressing the gas pedal harder than he intended, but the car didn't seem to be accelerating. The road stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of darkness and fog, as though it were pulling them deeper into whatever nightmare they had unknowingly driven into. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of something watching them never did. Ethan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He saw nothing except for the thick black fog swallowing up the world behind them. But that wasn't what terrified him. It was the air. The pressure that had been suffocating them in the car was thickening, heavier than before, like the atmosphere itself was becoming a living, breathing thing, pushing them toward the unknown. And then a sound came, faint at first, like the distant rustling of leaves, but it grew louder with each passing second. Ethan's eyes widened, his gut twisted into a knot. "There's something behind us," he whispered hoarsely. His voice felt trapped, as though the air around him had thickened to the point where it was suffocating his very breath. Max's hands trembled on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He didn't need to look back. He could feel it too. The car was being pursued. Whatever it was that had taken the place of the shadowy figure, it was close, very close. "Do you hear that?" Olivia's voice cracked as she clutched the door, her face pale, her eyes wide in disbelief. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. The sound was unmistakable now. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, yet unnervingly close. Tap, tap, tap. It was the unmistakable sound of something walking behind them, its steps measured, but somehow unnatural. And then the shadow moved. In the mirror, just on the edge of the light, a figure emerged from the fog. It was tall, much taller than any human should be, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of existence. One moment it was there, just barely visible, the next it was gone. It moved in erratic bursts, as if it was stretching through dimensions, each step bringing it closer to the car. "Max!" Olivia screamed, her voice strained. "It's right behind us." Max slammed his foot down harder on the gas. But it didn't matter. The road wasn't getting any shorter. The fog didn't clear. The trees on the sides of the road, if they were trees, didn't seem to move at all. They just watched, silent and unmoving. The very landscape felt wrong. "Why is the car not speeding up?" Max shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "I'm flooring it." Ethan twisted around in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the headrest. His gaze snapped from the rearview mirror to the window. Through the heavy fog, he saw the figure growing clearer. It was no longer flickering in and out. It was real. It was coming for them, and it wasn't alone. There were others, figures, all indistinct, shrouded in shadow, walking in unison toward the car. The shapes moved with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. As the car jolted forward, the road continued to stretch out, farther and farther into the abyss, and the figures were gaining. "There's no way out," Ethan said, his voice low, tinged with disbelief. "It's like we're trapped here." Max's grip on the wheel tightened. Sweat dripped down his forehead as the engine sputtered. For a moment, the car seemed to slow down even more, the headlights barely cutting through the mist. He didn't know what was happening, but whatever it was, it felt like they were being dragged deeper into this place by an invisible force. Ethan's heart pounded. He could feel it. Whatever was behind them wasn't just chasing them. It was haunting them. The footsteps grew louder, the tap 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 echoing from all sides now, as if something was surrounding them, closing in from the darkness. Ethan's breath quickened as the shadows in the rearview mirror became clearer. Their limbs were elongated, stretched unnaturally, their faces obscured by darkness and fog. But they weren't human. Not anymore. "Max, look out!" Olivia shrieked, pointing ahead. Ethan snapped his head forward, his stomach dropping. Ahead of them, the road split. Two paths, both identical, both leading into a darker expanse of trees and fog. He could feel the air getting colder, the temperature inside the car plummeting. It was like the road itself was a trap, a winding maze that didn't have an exit. Every path led deeper into the unknown. Which way? Max's voice was strained, his mind clearly unraveling as the pressure built. "Which way do we go?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He could feel the presence in the back of the car now. Something was inside with them, just behind him. A chill crept up his spine, and his skin tingled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "We go left," Ethan said finally, his voice almost a whisper, but it felt like the right choice. For no particular reason, it just felt right. Max nodded quickly and turned the wheel, veering the car toward the left path. But as soon as they did, the fog seemed to thicken, becoming a wall in front of them, blocking their view. It felt as though the very air was closing in, and no matter which direction they took, they would be swallowed up by the forest. The figures were still behind them. Their footsteps didn't falter, and they were getting closer, much closer. Ethan's eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, his heart hammering in his chest. They were within inches of the car now. Max's hand trembled as he gripped the wheel. "They're right behind us. What the hell are they?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He only knew one thing: they were coming for them. And no matter how fast they drove, the road would never end. Max's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The fog had thickened to an almost suffocating density, swallowing the headlights of the car, leaving only a shadow of their feeble glow behind. The road ahead was no longer visible, the endless stretch of black tar distorted by the swirling mist that crept in through the cracks of the car's windows. It was as if they were floating in a void, trapped between worlds. Behind them, the figures were closer now. Max could feel it, feel them, pressing in on the car, their chilling presence invading the very air around them. The tapping footsteps were now a constant, steady rhythm. Closer and closer they came, their shape flickering in and out of sight like the pulse of a dying light. "We need to get out of here," Olivia gasped, clutching her seatbelt with trembling hands. Her voice was barely audible over the steady hum of the engine and the maddening sound of footsteps. "I'm trying," Max snapped, his voice strained, but it felt futile. The car, no matter how hard he pushed the accelerator, wouldn't go any faster. It was like something was holding them back, keeping them here. He slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. Ethan's breath hitched as he glanced out the side window, his heart hammering in his chest. He caught sight of something moving in the fog, something that wasn't human. The trees, they weren't just trees anymore. They were like twisted, gnarled figures, their limbs stretched out, their branches reaching like claws toward the car. They seemed to be alive, watching them, guiding them into the abyss. "Max, stop the car," Ethan said in a low, terrified voice. Max's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The figures were closer now, their distorted bodies shifting with unnatural speed. It wasn't just their footsteps they could hear. It was a low, guttural whisper, a voice, no, multiple voices, murmuring in a language that seemed to scrape the very soul. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking. "Do you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her voice shaking. Max didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed ahead, his mind racing. The road stretched before them like a serpent, winding, twisting, endless. But there was something else now. At the end of the road, just beyond the fog, Max thought he saw it. An opening, a faint light glowing through the mist. "Is that an exit?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Max didn't answer. His foot hovered over the brake pedal, but something in him urged him to keep driving, to push forward toward that strange, flickering light. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that promised to end this nightmare. But as they got closer, the light dimmed, flickered, and finally vanished, swallowed by the mist. The car jerked forward, as if the road itself had shifted beneath them. "Max, stop!" Olivia screamed, but it was too late. The car lurched violently to a stop, throwing them forward in their seats. Max's breath left him in a ragged gasp as he glanced around. They had come to a halt, but the road was gone. All that was left was darkness. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as he looked outside the window. There was nothing but a vast, empty chasm. The road had vanished, as though it had never existed at all. In its place was a towering black void that stretched infinitely upward and downward. No trees, no fog, just an endless, inky abyss. "What is this?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Max's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. He tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered and died. No matter how many times he turned the key, it wouldn't start. "It's over," Max muttered, his voice hollow. Ethan looked at him, his face pale. "What do you mean it's over? What's happening?" Max's voice cracked. "We're not on the road anymore. We're in something else. We're trapped. There's no way out." Olivia's eyes darted nervously around the car. The cold air had become suffocating, and the shadows outside seemed to pulse, alive, watching them. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices rising from the depths of the void. Ethan felt his skin crawl. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it did no good. The voices were inside his head now, swirling, chanting, calling to him. "Max, what are we supposed to do?" Olivia's voice was small and frightened, almost drowned out by the rising cacophony. Max's face twisted in despair. I don't know, Olivia. We can't escape. We're stuck here." The sound of footsteps started again. Not outside the car, but inside. Soft tapping. Slow. Deliberate. They all turned toward the back seat, their eyes wide with terror. The figure was sitting there now in the dark just behind them. It was tall, far too tall to fit in the back seat. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, twisted in impossible ways. Its eyes glowed faintly red, like two coals in a darkened fire. Its mouth opened, wide, far too wide, stretching unnaturally, as if it were smiling at them. "Why are you here?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure did not answer. Instead, its long, spindly fingers reached toward them. Its touch was cold, impossibly cold, and it was drawing closer, inch by inch. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. And then, from the darkness outside the car, other figures appeared. More shadows, stretching out of the void, their shapes flickering and contorting. Max's breath caught in his throat. "We're not alone." And then, the figure spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can never leave." The car lurched again, but this time, there was no escape. The doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't roll down. The world outside the car was consuming them, and no matter how hard they tried, the car wouldn't move. Max's heart pounded as he realized the truth. They were never going to escape. The road had led them here, and now, they were trapped. Forever.